It's Wednesday Evening Live.
Tonight's special guest, theologian and C.S. Lewis scholar, Dr. Jerry Root.
Well, good evening and welcome to Wednesday Evening Live. My very special guest tonight is the director of the Institute for Strategic Evangelism at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. He's also one of the world's leading C.S. Lewis scholars, having written numerous articles and books about the British writer and lay theologian. Dr. Root, it's great to have you on the program today. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be here.
Well, I want to begin. I want to talk about C.S. Lewis, but for those who may be watching tonight and who are unfamiliar with C.S. Lewis, the man, the writer, the lay theologian, can you give us just a brief synopsis of who Lewis was before we go into our discussion?
Yes, he grew up in Belfast, Ireland, but did most of his schooling in England. His mother died when he was 9 years old, and it set him on a quest to try to understand how evil works, and eventually he became an atheist. It wasn't until he was a teacher at Oxford University that he finally became a Christian. And he said one of the human causes of his conversion was his friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien, also the writer of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The last 9 years of his career, he was a full professor at Cambridge University. After he became a Christian, he started putting pen to paper, and he became known as one of the great world Christian apologists for the Christian faith. But his reputation of the many books he wrote, there were 56 books he wrote during his lifetime. There are
Wow.
73 books now, because some have pulled together his letters, they've pulled together articles that were written on common themes and put them under common cover. But he wrote in about, depending on how you count them, 11 to 17 different literary genres. He was a well-rounded, faith-integrated, liberal arts scholar. So anytime a new question would come up, he would try to consider that question in an essay or a book, and he would consider it as a faith-integrated approach to managing that particular problem. Lewis once wrote, all of my books, or most of my books, are evangelistic. Now, they weren't explicitly so, but what he meant by that is we don't need more books by Christians. We need more books by Christians on other topics with their Christianity latent. So that's the guy. That's C.S.
Wow.
Lewis.
Wow. When I meet a new Christian or we lead someone to the Lord, the very first book that I recommend that they read outside of the Bible would be Lewis's Mere Christianity. And I think that's just such an important book for every Christian to read and begin to, I guess, kind of peel back the mind of C.S. Lewis as an
You're
apologist.
right to recommend that, Mike, because when he wrote that book, they were originally broadcast talks on the BBC during World War II. He was second only to Winston Churchill, being heard on the BBC as a non-BBC commentator, and he was asked to help people begin to think through issues of faith while that country was under the cloud of the threat of being taken over by Nazi Germany.
Mm, wow. Um, Lewis has been dead for 56 years. This year will be 57 years. Why is C.S. Lewis relevant in today's culture?
Well, there are several things. Again, he tried to address different questions from a faith integrated approach. And we've got, for example, right now, COVID-19, it's affecting the world. Think of the great nuclear disaster during Cold War. And as Lewis addressed those particular problems in essays and sermons and so forth, the very things that he wrote about then have great relevance to us today. He said war does not increase death. He could have said disease doesn't increase death, accidents don't increase death, aging doesn't increase death, because death is total in every generation.
Mm,
The great thing about war, or the great thing about death, is that it's certain and it's imminent. It could happen to anyone at any time. And he said, as he addressed the issue of nuclear holocaust, He said, if you ask the person, well, what should we do today, given the fact that all of civilization could be destroyed by a nuclear war? He said, well, you should do the same thing that they did during the plagues in the 16th century in England, or the same thing that they did in villages along the coastline in England when they could be raided by Vikings. He said, what you
Hmm.
want to do is the things that are human things. You want to do the common things. You want to be able to be washing the babies. You want to be able to have conversations with your friend. You want to continue doing the very human things that we should all be doing. As a matter of fact, if you knew you were going to die in a week, what would you do differently?
Hmm.
And the answer should be, I wouldn't do anything differently because I've settled the death issue and I'm living on purpose right now. So
Wow.
Lewis calls us to a sense of purpose, which I think is wonderful in all of his books, and that's always relevant. He addresses the deeply human problems. Every generation has unique problems to its day. They flare up like 4th of July fireworks and they're out like ash. But there are
Mm.
constant human problems that occur generation after generation. And Lewis addressed these. That's very important. The other thing, too, is we live in an era where you've got such polarity
Mm.
and polarization. Polarity is not bad. You've got a North Pole and a South Pole. That's the analogy, right? They really exist and you can have dialogue. But polarization is to stay stuck at your pole and not consider that another person has a point of view that might be valid. Lewis was great in engaging in argument. He avoided informal fallacy. He understood how truth worked and how reason works. I have people all the time that tell me, oh, that was a lie, or this is the truth. And I say, really? So you must be an expert on truth. Please define truth for me. They can't even define it. They're
Mm.
unfamiliar with 1,000 years of discussion of these things and the way truth has been defined. There are always anomalies that come up, like relativism and stuff. But these things die out. They don't have a long history because they're insufficient in resolving the problem. But the ancient Greeks, the biblical writers, and so forth, they all understood that a statement is true when it says what is. Truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. And
Mm.
Lewis was brilliant in modeling this for us. He was engaged in one great literary critical debate with the master of Jesus College in Cambridge, England. His name was E.M.W. Tilliard. The book is called The Personal Heresy. It's a wonderful debate. There's not one ad hominem argument in it, not one red herring, not one false analogy. These two guys knew how to discuss in a way that produced light, not heat. That is always relevant, and today especially, because I think we've lost the capacity to do this.
Yeah, I agree. And that, what would you say uh, along those lines for the church today, for Christians today? We become so, as you said, polarized, maybe on political or ideological views that we cross our arms and we don't want to hear the other argument. Lewis is a great example of what we can do and what we should do as believers. But is there anything you'd speak to in that regard, though, about what you would say to believers today?
Well, I don't know exactly what he would say, but I could tell you what he modeled for us. And that would be this: a rolled eye is not a refutation. Somebody
Mm.
says something and we disagree with it, and we roll our eyes. That shows that we must not know how to argue our point because we would have engaged with that person. It also shows we lack humility because we think we're better than that other person. If somebody says to me, somebody I might respect or something like that, or somebody I know, something to me that would be contrary to my theological or political or moral beliefs, I don't say to them, well, you must be stupid. I say, wow, you're a human being. You have value. Explain to me your point of view. I'm very interested. I want to hear
Wow.
what you have to say. If we don't begin with the assumption that we've got it all figured out, all of us have dead branches that need to be pruned on occasion. Enter into the discussion that would be helpful. Your life will be more fruitful if you do some significant pruning. And also, if you engage with that person to show you really good Christian character, you're not going to do it in an obnoxious way. And
Yeah.
the second thing, to show you're thinking, a thinking Christian, you're going to do it in a way where you can set forth your position reasonably. If you can't set forth your position reasonably, then just be a good listener.
Hmm.
But I think you can have points of view. And I don't think anybody on the political spectrum is going to have it all together. So therefore, there might be some good things they have to say, and there might be some bad things. There might be some good things your heroes have to say, and there might be some bad things. And consequently, it's good for us, I think, to, with humility of mind, engage in these discussions. Don't run from them. And certainly don't say, well, because you have that view and I have this view, there must be a middle ground. No, there might not be a middle ground. Truth may lie on one side or the other. But a serious thinker will try to understand what the reality is that supports the claim, or try to show how there is no reality and therefore the claim is invalid.
Mm.
It was helpful in that way.
And the Apostle Peter in 1 Peter 3 verse 15 really encapsulates that. When he says we need to be ready always to give a reason for the hope that's within us, yet we do it with gentleness and with respect. And I think we could throw in the word humility with that.
Well, there's also a concern because there's a temptation that's peculiar to Christianity or any person who has any kind of religious conviction. And I don't say you should not have religious conviction. I'm just saying you should be mindful of the potential for abuse. In Reflections on the Psalms, C.S. Lewis said, the worst of bad men are religious bad men. The quicker I might be willing to die for my faith, maybe the quicker I'd be willing to kill for my faith, or paint a thus saith the Lord across my own opinions. I believe, I'm an inerrantist. I believe the Bible's inerrant, the
Yes.
original authors. But I believe it's the pre-interpreted text that's original, that's inerrant, not the interpreted text. So I'm extending a thus saith the Lord to my opinions. That's borderline blasphemy. I don't think it
Yes.
is blasphemy because I don't think people are realizing they're doing it. But it's a matter of great danger. Plus, if I think my opinion is equal to the word of God, I will immediately be dismissive of the opinion of another person and do it in such an arrogant way. I believe in absolutes. I believe in them theoretically, but I don't know anything absolutely. And I remember one time I was giving a talk on C.S. Lewis and postmodernism. And this woman in the midst of the lecture jumped up and said, "We don't need all of any of this." It was at a Christian gathering. There were about 200 people there. Can you imagine a person jumping up, screaming out, "We don't need any of this" in the middle of your lecture? I couldn't
No.
avoid her. So I said, "Well, make your point." She says, "We don't need any of this because we have the mind of Christ." I said, "Yeah, the Bible says that. Do you know where?" She said, "No, she didn't know." I said, "Well, it's in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 16. But when Paul said it in chapter 1, he had chided the church at Corinth because they were so divided. One said we're of Paul, one said we're of Apollos, one said we're of Peter, one said we're of Christ. I said, if they had the mind of Christ in the way you seem to suggest, like a settled fact, they've achieved omniscience, then I think you've missed it completely. You haven't understood what Paul said. He said we have the mind of Christ as an available resource, and with that resource, a responsibility to try and understand it the best we can. And no single person's perspective on it is going to give them the breadth and depth of omniscience. So consequently, we don't want to alienate other people in our communities lest we lose out on the perspective that they could bring us that could help us understand these things more robustly. I think Lewis is good at this. That's why he was involved in a group called the Inklings, where they were involved in discussion, talking about ideas. Lewis says of friendship, your first friend is a person who reads all the same books you read and comes up with the same position you come up with. That shows you you're not crazy. Your second friend is a person who reads all the same books you read and comes up with a different perspective, which causes you to have to think through your position and engage in reasonable discourse. All that stuff is healthy.
That's great. Um, Kind of transitioning here just a little bit. You wrote a tremendous book entitled C.S. Lewis and a Problem of Evil, an
Did you read
investigation
that
of.
book? Did you
Yes, I
read it?
have.
Because I think only you and my mother then read that book. Most of my books are only bought by anesthesiologists because they find they're cheaper to prescribe than the drugs and hold people in a deeper sleep longer.
No, 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 no. That's not true. That's not true. Uh, in the book, Lewis was concerned about an aspect of the problem of evil he called subjectivism.
Yeah.
What is that, and what is an example of it in today's culture?
Well, again, truth has to be validated by reality. If I can't get to reality to support my claim, then I can maybe claim it as a probable thing and call it opinion. Opinions based on probability rather than certainty, subject to doubt, reasonable people could differ. But if I can't get to even opinion and probability, it's just prejudice. It's just
Mm,
prejudice. If I disassociate myself from reality, then I am coming self referentially. And almost like a spider, I spin my sense of truth as a spider spins its web. It all comes from myself, and it usually drifts towards being utilitarian. It starts using other people, starts manipulating other people, and so forth. So, subjectivism is when the subject is no longer responsive to the object, the reality that gives substance to the claim,
mm,
and the subject then becoming self referential drifts basically into a reduced self. They're human, but they're not able to connect with reality. Lewis writes a great fiction book about this called um, the Great Divorce,
mhm.
about these people who are in hell who have a chance to come up to heaven, and they have so diminished themselves because they've denied reality that they can't even connect with one another or with the real world. So usually when we think of subjectivism, that's what we think. The subjective is okay. That's my perspective. But it has to be properly related to an objective world that gives validity to the point of view. When the subject severs itself from the objective world, you have subjectivism.
Mm. Um, talk for a
And it
moment,
drifts
if you.
towards evil. It generally, if it's self referential, it will drift towards evil. The
Yes,
fall, if it's anything, is man trying to play God of his own life. And,
yeah,
and consequently, anarchists make bad community people.
yes, yes, and Lewis, I think in the screw tape letters, uh, screw tape is encouraging Wormwood to to kind of get man into that way of thinking, into subjectivism, um, right? I mean,
Well,
there's a.
that's very perceptive of you, Michael. The very first letter from Screw Tape to Wormwood is an attack on reason. He says,
Mhm,
whatever you do, don't get your patient to enter into arguments. Because if they enter into real arguments, you're moving them to the enemy's ground. The enemy would be God's ground. Because faith should be rooted in reason. If it's
yeah,
not rooted in reason, if it's not reasonable, there may be things about the faith that transcend reason. They may be supra rational, but nothing should be irrational in faith.
mhm,
And so Screw Tape is trying to get Wormwood to get him away from anything that's reasonable and to get away from reason itself. Because if I could get them, if Screw Tape could get the patient away from reason, then he could be manipulated in a host of ways.
yes,
And you can have
yes,
people of faith who could be manipulated too, and in the worst possible way, because they could paint a "Thus saith the Lord" across their own opinion, and it'd be very dangerous.
yes, yes. That's really um, that's very helpful, I think, for people that are watching tonight. And the screw tape letters is I love the screw tape letters even more so than like the Chronicles of Narnia. Eh, what would you say one of your favorite works of Lewis would be?
Well, I usually say to somebody who asks me that question, whichever book I happen to be reading at the moment.
Uh huh.
So, a couple days ago, I read um, The Great Divorce again. Right now, I'm reading through this single volume of all of his essays, and I'm enjoying those immensely. You mentioned Screw Tape. I've given a couple talks on Screw Tape recently, so I've been revisiting those particular books. There's a humility that comes through those books. While Screw Tape is as arrogant as all get out, Lewis
Hmm.
is writing the thing upside down and he's analyzing his own soul. He wrote in the preface to the second edition, some have paid me the undeserved compliment of supposing my letters were the ripe fruit of many years' study of ascetic and moral theology. They forget that there's an equally reliable, though less creditable way to show me how wickedness works. My heart, I need no other, showeth me the way of the ungodly. There's a
Mm.
humility in Lewis when he writes, and I think
Yeah.
it's attractive too. I think it draws us in. So I like
Yes.
those books. His literary criticism, the one I like an awful lot. Although I've read Oxford History of English Literature, is a 700-page book. You laugh your way through it. It's brilliant. And also experiment criticism. He says, in coming to understand anything, I must reject the facts as they are for me in favor of the facts as they are. Lewis says, I want God, not my idea of God. I want my neighbor, not my idea of my neighbor. I want my spouse, not my idea of my spouse. I want myself, not my idea of myself. We can have inflated views of ourselves as well. There are many books that people neglect that Lewis wrote. I just came up with a new book. It just came out today, actually, with Mark Lewis. We've done another book together on Lewis's imagination. But this one looks at books that nobody reads that Lewis wrote. And they're his literary critical works, the area where he had his professional occupation writing literary critical works at Oxford and Cambridge. And if you want to find out what's at the root of his Narnia books or Screw Tape Letters or the science fiction or his fiction and so forth, if you even want to find out what's at the root of his essays or his Christian apologetics, you should read these books that many people neglect, the C.S. Lewis, the ones that we covered in the neglected C.S. Lewis.
That's great. And where can people get that book?
They can get it on Amazon.
Okay.
Here's a copy of it. The
Wow.
Neglected C.S. Lewis just came out today, but they could go to Amazon and get it if they wanted to.
Okay. Wonderful.
It's Paraclete. It's published by Paraclete, so they could write to the publisher too if they wanted.
Okay. Wonderful. And um, Alistair McGrath, um, a great book, and I've got it sitting here. Uh, C.S. Lewis, A Life. You've read this, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've
He
given lectures on McGrath before too.
he says eccentric genius, reluctant prophet. Would you agree?
Say it again. I didn't hear it very well.
Eccentric genius, reluctant prophet.
Um, I, I I don't know how eccentric I'd say he was. I would say he was an informed genius, which in our day, because so many people try to talk in an uninformed way, that looks eccentric. But I think that Lewis probably is closer to the standard than the person who might call him eccentric.
I see.
I think he was a reluctant prophet, but I also think that he said of Christianity that it was something that can and must be talked about. He was not an evangelist by giftedness, but he was an evangelist because the mantle fell upon him. And if you look at his work, you see he wrote great books in evangelism that are apologetics.
Mm-hmm.
He did his literary life by looking at things from a Christian point of view. He started the Oxford Socratic Club at Oxford University, where during term you'd have a Christian read a paper and the non Christians would attack it. The next week, a non Christian would read a paper and the Christians would attack it, but they kept lively dialogue and they avoided the informal fallacies that distract from good dialogue. So he was involved with students in that way. He was out preaching sermons. During World War II, he would preach to the RAF airmen because they were dying in droves, and he would preach
Wow.
evangelical messages to them. He was involved in working. He had small groups with students that he would meet with, and several came to faith through those small groups. If you've
Wow.
ever read the book Severe Mercy with Sheldon von Alken, he was one of those guys who came to Christ during that time. And the guy that started Regent College in Vancouver, Jim Hewson, he was one of the guys that started that school. He was in a small group with C.S. Lewis for many, many years. So this was a guy who took seriously his faith, as all of us should. Um, Again, he didn't have the gift of evangelism, but he did evangelism in his profession as an academic, and he did it in a very efficient way. He also answered all of his letters. Some people told him, "You're wasting your time answering all your mail because you could be writing more books." Well, there's actually 8 volumes of his letters that are published now because they were so pithy, people saved them. And there's one man named Paul Ford who put together all the letters Lewis wrote in spiritual formation and put them under a single volume called Yours, Jack. Great book for a pastor to use to see
Okay.
the advice he gave to seekers and people who were looking for faith. Why did Lewis do that? In his letters, he was doing evangelistic work. and spiritual formation and pastoring people. Not because he had a calling, a vocational calling to do this, but as a Christian, he had a calling to do this, as all Christians should. I think this is remarkable. He's a remarkable model for us.
Yeah. Um, Lewis, you touched on it just a second ago, and I guess with you being there at Wheaton College and the Billy Graham Center, um, evangelism, um, eh, the Great Commission, evangelism, it's a call for all believers. We don't have to be an itinerant evangelist to evangelize. We can take and use our everyday life and what God has gifted us with, like Lewis was in his writings. Uh, we can, we all should be using our life and our vocations to evangelize and to reach people.
If you're a human being ensconced in community with breath in your lungs, God has selected you for that world where you find yourself. And if you have gifts, and everybody has some sort of gift, let's say
Yes.
you're good at fixing food, then you do your evangelism around your table through hospitality. If you have the gift of service, maybe you're really good at turning nuts and bolts, then you go around and help the widows or the divorcees in your community whose cars aren't working. You put in a new starter motor for them, or maybe help somebody with their plumbing. And you do your evangelism through acts of service. If you have resources and the gift of giving, people with the gift of giving usually have the gift of making, and you have the gift of making money, then use that money as a means of evangelism. It says in Luke 16:9, make friends by means make friends by means of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. It shows somebody using their material goods to woo the heart of a person, to see in your acts of kindness to them the acts of God's kindness directed to them, and you share the gospel then and lead them to Christ. It's wonderful.
I love it.
If you have
I
the gift
love,
of teaching like Lewis, then use teaching to share Christ.
yes, yes. One final thing before we go. I saw online where you had done a C.S. Lewis Christmas. Talk about that, because I'm people that know me know that I love Christmas, and I'm very intrigued. I would love to have you come here to Northwest Arkansas. Just give me a brief synopsis of that, if you would. Uh, the thing you do at Christmas.
Well, Michael, I'm probably a little bit lost. Here's the reason why. I'm a techno doofus. I don't know how to do technology. My kids came to me one time and said, "Dad, Google your name," and I saw there were all these things out there, YouTubes and talks and
Yeah.
stuff like that. I've been lecturing on Lewis for 40 years. I've been studying him for 50. I did my master's and my doctorate both on Lewis. I've lectured on him in 78 universities in 18 different countries. There's so much stuff out there, I wouldn't even remember what the Christmas talk was. I'm just so
Okay.
sorry.
No, no,
Lewis
that's okay.
Lewis liked Christmas, and one of his worst characters was the White Witch of Narnia, who made it always winter and never Christmas. What could be more evil than leaving Christmas out, right?
That's it. That's it. Wow. Well, Dr. Root, I have so enjoyed this discussion, and I want to have you back on in the future. We can talk about other things besides Lewis. But I love Lewis. You love Lewis, and I want people to, if they've never read a C.S. Lewis book, whether it's his fiction or his children's books or his theological works. I just want people to get familiar with this great Christian layman, C.S. Lewis. Do you
Well,
have
If,
what book?
if somebody says to me, "Where should I start with Lewis?" I always ask them, "What are you interested in?" Because he writes so many different books. If they like fiction, then I direct them that way. I say adult or children's or science fiction. If they like to read pithy, thoughtful things, I suggest maybe his essays or his Christian apologetics. If they like literature, then I try to find out where they like to go in literature, and I suggest some of the books that he wrote on literary themes and whatnot. So it just, there's such a wide array of material. If they like satire, I suggest his books on satire and so on. So I think there's always a place where a person could start. But
Yeah.
if in fact they like a little bit of all of it and they don't know where they want to go, there's a short book, the Great Divorce, that gives you a good entry into his writing style. It's fiction. You don't want to press his theology. People will take liberties in their fiction. You don't want to press his theology onto it, but he opens you imaginatively to think through some great theological themes. That might be a good place to start. The Great Divorce. You could read it in an evening. It's very short.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Root, for joining us. I look forward to continuing this at a later date. We can come back together and talk. And thank you so much. God bless you, and praying for your family as you guys, as all of us are just in this new normal with COVID-19. But thanks so much for joining us tonight. And if you want to get Dr. Root's new book, Lewis, Exploring the Riches of His Most Overlooked Books, you can go to Amazon.com. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I look forward to
All right.
doing it again.
Amen. Thank you.
To purchase books by Dr. Jerry Root, including his new book, The Neglected C.S. Lewis, search for him on Amazon.com. My recommendation for my personal favorite book by C.S. Lewis is his classic work, Mere Christianity.